So I'm really pleased this morning to be joined by Daryl. Daryl Fielding is here to give up your time to answer some questions. So Daryl, thank you very much for doing so.
You're so welcome. It's great fun.
So we do, we hope so. That is the plan. So before we dive into the questions, just to give a little bit of a context, I'm just going to give a little bit of a background into your career. I know you're going to go into kind of greater detail, but you're a portfolio non-exec director, and to give context to some of the things you've done. So 8 years as you co-founded, and then you spent 8 years as CEO of the Marketing Academy Foundation, which, for anyone who isn't aware of it, is a fantastic organization where you help really talented young people who are looking to pursue a career in marketing and to really kind of support them on that journey. And in addition to that, 3 other boards as well. So First Give, quite diverse, I like these. So First Give, the Academy of Ancient Music, and the Association of Chartered and Certified Accountants. So some great diversity there. In amongst all of this, 3 years ago now, you wrote your book, the brand book. If you got a copy of that there. I know you're going to probably mention a bit more there. Yeah, it's got your amazing book, which is your sort of how-to guide on brand strategy. So I look forward to hear more about that. And then in terms of careers, so you've, I guess, quite unusually for some people, you've worked both client and agency side and held senior roles in both, and certainly client side. Some great brands, so Vodafone, Cadbury, we've got Dove, Ford, Vauxhall, so a real diversity of some very, very big global brands there. So Daryl, I'm excited to kind of enter into this conversation with you. I did like, as the team have put together the research, they put down here, the most commonly used word for Daryl is refreshing. And having just been chatting with you before we came to hit record, I would agree. It's an absolute pleasure. Thank you. Would you kick us off by just really giving us an insight into your career journey, what led you to where you are now, and any standout moments along the way?
Yes, I will. I'm going to concentrate rather on the standout moments, actually, because to coin a current phrase, my career has been a little bit squiggly and quite long. So I don't want to bore everybody to death by going through a sort of, and then I did this, and then I did that. I've basically had sort of 6 phases in my career. What people often don't know is I had every intention of becoming a science academic. I had a degree in physiology, and I went to do a postgrad. And I had every intention of becoming a university lecturer. I absolutely hated it and sort of withdrew and had a bit of a rethink. And that then took me into quite a long stint in major ad agencies on the advertising side. I then sort of decided I wanted a proper grown-up job. So I switched to being a commercial director and then to senior roles in marketing on, as you say, the client side. I then sort of ran screaming from the corporate room, and I will talk about that a little bit later about, kind of figuring out what good looked like in this portfolio world. And I'm about to start something of my own based on some of the content in the brand book. So watch this space for later in the year. So that's a summary of a career that spanned quite a few decades now. And the big problem with being a portfolio non-exec is it's really hard to introduce yourself. So I'm still working on that. And when I've got it down, maybe you'll have me back on and I can explain, kind of what does connect, what is the red thread that connects those board roles. But what I thought your listeners might be more interested in is maybe some of the sort of career highlights and the big learning that I got out of each of those arguably successes that I've had. So if it's okay, I'll just sort of talk through half a dozen of those in a very short story, and then kind of what that taught me. And I think the first sort of big success for me was when I was brought on to run the Vauxhall business at Lowe. I'd had, kind of a reasonably good career in agencies up until that point. And it was at a moment of crisis. Vauxhall accounted for half the profit in that London office of Lower Howard Spink at the time. And prior to me being brought on to sort of rescue the situation, the agency had just produced an absolutely amazing TV commercial featuring all the supermodels. And the process of getting that done, plus some rather injudicious remarks that were reported by the press at a time when Vauxhall were actually cutting headcount, caused a sort of, kind of a fury in the client, and they put us on 6 months' notice. So if you think about facing into that, we would have had to have made half the staff redundant if we didn't get that account back. And it was a formal written notice, 6 months we had to fix it. And myself and the then managing director, the lovely David Weldon, who you presumably know quite well, and he and I still have that sort of been through the wars together connection, I think. Kind of we had to work on fixing, what the problem was. And it was really just talking and listening to the client, understanding what they couldn't stand about us. And there was quite a lot, and not doing that anymore, and making sure that that was sort of institutionalized in how we worked with them. I remember going to see David before he was going up to the client to find out if we had retained the business. And I did say to him, whatever happens, David, you've been amazing. You couldn't have done more. I've got so much respect for you, and whatever the outcome, you must know that you couldn't have done more. And he was quite moved by this, and said to me, well, it's amazing when you're in charge of something that how little anybody pats you on the head. And he really appreciated me coming to say that. So 2 things that I learned. We did retain the business, by the way, so there was a happy ending, which was fantastic. And I think 2 things that came out of that for me. One was, if you have something nice to say that's sincere to somebody more senior than you, take your heart in your mouth and go and say that, because I do think that in more senior roles, it is lonelier and people don't get appreciated much. And I didn't realize that. So that was a bit of a light bulb moment. And I think the other bigger, deeper lesson I had was really at quite a young age. I think I was 35, the sense of responsibility to the workforce. I imagine that if I failed, somebody who perhaps worked in the studio, who didn't have anything to do with what the client didn't like, would go home to his wife and tell him he'd lost his job that day, and she would cry. And so that real sense of responsibility to the people whose jobs depend on your success, I think, was a huge learning. And I don't think necessarily that in marketing one always considers that. There's so much talk about growth or whatever, but at the end of the day, keeping people in work is actually quite a big part of what matters and what we do. And I think the only thing I've ever cried over in my career is on those occasions when I've had to make people redundant. Obviously not in front of them, it's always worse for them than for you. But if people lose their jobs as a result of something, that's the thing that has distressed me, I think the most. So maybe that's part of that underlying wish to enable employment for others, and part of the drive for co-founding the Marketing Academy Foundation.
And that's an incredible foundation, and you've helped so many young people start out on their marketing career. That's a really nice kind of transition into that area. And how do you go about this? How do are you able to give an insight to how does the foundation work, and how can other senior leaders help?
Yes, well, I think if we're not aware of it, we should be aware of how relentlessly middle class our industry is. And homogeneity is not a good thing. Not a good thing that, there's very little representation of, a lot of, of customers who are buying the products that the the brand owners are actually making. So it is wrong. It's not good for the organizations, and it's also not fair. It's not equitable, and it's wrong that the industry is not accessible to young people from the bottom socioeconomic group backgrounds, really. So I think there is a real ethical drive for that. But beyond that, the industry is massively missing out on talent. And I think this is, it vexes me in the extreme, I have to say, that all of these things are sort of, not being dealt with. Most employers would say, what kind of people are you looking for? They want, in marketing, they would say, we want bright young people. We want people that are hardworking. We want people that are entrepreneurial. We want them resilient. And by the way, we'd quite like a bit of a low dose of entitlement. Well, look no further than the young people who come from poorer backgrounds. There are plenty there who are seriously bright. They've done incredibly well academically, despite the fact that they are the children of people who are doing more manual people who are doing manual work and less, kind of executive level positions. You look at a CV, you will find somebody who has flipped burgers throughout their university education. I could give you a good guess that those are not the posh children that those employers are used to seeing. They will have had setbacks and knockbacks and difficulties, and they'll have to figure out how to get stuff done. Just getting to university would demonstrate a degree of resilience. A lot of them have side hustles, because they need the money. They're not, playing. They actually need to earn some more money. So that entrepreneurial quality is absolutely there, not because it's fun, but because they could do with a dosh. And also, they're almost the opposite of entitled, which is also sometimes a source of frustration. One time there, we had some young people working at the Nationwide, and we put on a training course for them, and they said they couldn't come because they couldn't afford the train fare. That's how they've viewed it, whereas somebody from a middle class background would have just assumed that would be paid for. So that was a little small example of how sometimes you go, no, this is possible for you. There are those expectations that are not there. So I think knowing that there is this talent base out there is just extraordinary. And what the Marketing Academy Foundation does is to find an employer that will give that young person an opportunity, a year's paid work with proper work to do. Yeah. An apprentice could be a formal apprenticeship, a statutory apprenticeship, or just a sort of facsimile of that. And then we will go to market and we will find somebody that fits that bill. Mostly we will coach them to help them succeed at the interview, because they haven't got anyone at home to teach them how to interview for an executive position. Mostly what we hear from those employers is we'd have taken 3 of them. We would usually put 3 to 4 candidates as a final selection. We would have had, if we had more opportunities, we'd have hired more. So we can, really good at finding those individuals, knowing what will be a good fit for the role. Most of the team at the Marketing Academy Foundation have got, solid careers in the industry, so they know what they're looking for. And also, many of them have been hired permanently. Amazon in particular is one of our sort of repeat customers for this program. And, they have had young people that they have chosen to keep because they're so good. So, the fact that we're a charity, I sometimes think undermines the benefit of what we do, yeah, because people think they're going to get people who are in some way less, and that is not the case at all. I think in many regards they're more. They've got a lot of the qualities that the employers are seeking, and are actually really rather loyal employees once hired permanently. So it's a win-win-win, if only people will be open-minded to the possibility and be prepared perhaps to invest a little more time in bringing them into the organization, because they won't have learnt about corporate life at the breakfast table. Most of them don't have a breakfast table, frankly. And, you know, kind of if they can just give up their addiction to polish, which is what they're hiring for now, and actually recognise that that middle class homogeneity is more of a risk than the risk they'd be taking on somebody with different qualities from a different background. Very long answer, apologies. I can rant
No,
for hours on this topic actually. So
well, you're clearly really passionate about it, and quite right so. And I think the work that you and your colleagues have done is incredible. I've volunteered to support with the boot camps for the interview
yes,
skills.
thank
I'm
you.
clearly in a pretty good position to help out with that. I think it's absolutely brilliant. And thank you, because that gives a great insight to anyone who may not yet be familiar with the great work that you do. Looking generally then at, so the next one is about senior marketers. So I'm thinking now, Darren, in terms of advice you would give to senior marketers who are looking to, or marketers who are looking to progress. I'm loath to use the word ladder, having been at the squiggly careers things. I think they'll be going, no, it's not how it works. But anyone who's looking to progress within their marketing career, what advice would you pass to them?
Well, I think the biggest thing I would say is to work for a while in a department that's earning the money instead of spending it. Interestingly, until I got to Vodafone, actually, in my career, I had mostly worked in, if you like, revenue generating roles and functions, because in an agency, as a leader of teams, you obviously are driving the revenue and you have a client and you're accountable for that income. You know, from, you know, running the Dove business and bringing that campaign to life across, you know, kind of 5 years of my life, to being at Mondelez in a FMCG company where, you know, they're much more P&L owning in the way that they structure and utilize their marketers. When I got to Vodafone, there was just a completely different structure. And I think it is for me. And I think it's the structure that's very, very common, where marketing is the marketing communications department, and it really has responsibility for those outputs, as opposed to the other pillars of marketing, such as, you know, price, product, point of sale, and one or two other P's, depending on which book you're reading and how many it thinks there are. And I think that as a consequence of that, many marketers grow up with a very poor grip on commercials. It's one of the reasons I think they may end up getting bullied within their companies, because as they grow more senior, they can't have a discourse with the chief financial officer or the commercial marketing or the product teams. And they just lack that real commercial sense. You can learn it, and that's helpful, but feeling the heat of that is something completely different. And interestingly, when I did get to Vodafone as the, you know, the sort of managing director in charge of brand marketing, Vodafone UK, everybody said I was the most commercial person they'd ever had in that role, which slightly surprised me.
Because you've had that, you
Because I'd had that revenue owning experience, or worked in or with client organizations or in the brand owner, where marketing was the driver of the P&L. You own a sort of mini P&L, and your P&L gets bigger from, you know, one deodorant SKU to the whole beauty category or something like that. So, but that is not typical. I think it's one of the reasons why there's quite a big appetite for ex-FMCG marketers, even though everybody goes, oh, they're digital dinosaurs. Not true, but because they have had that commercial experience. So if you're going to go squiggly, to sort of loop background, you know, take a sideways move even to a commercial role or an operational role that will equip you if you want to be ultimately the chief executive. If you've just done comms, I just don't think you're ever going to be a chief executive in a company. I think you have to have felt that, you know, either operational heat or revenue heat.
I would agree. I would agree on that. And taking that then across to non-exec, so you've built a really very fascinating, and I refer to it as kind of diverse, interesting a group of non-exec roles. What about people who are looking to go into, considering a move into their sort of first dip with non-exec roles? Any tips for kind of how, you know, how typically, probably the question I would get asked the most is, how do you get your first one? Because I think once you got your first one, the second and third are easy. But how, any advice you could share, how do you get your first non-exec role?
Yes, I think it's an incredibly worthwhile thing, particularly for marketers to do, because it does give them a very different lens on how companies operate. So I think a couple of things. First of all, really look at what is actually involved and is it for you? You know, I think a lot of people expect that it's advisory. It's not. You will be looking at, you know, a lot of financial information, a lot of risk analysis, you know, quite serious subjects that are very little to do with marketing or brand, actually. So I think the first question is to have a real look at what does that work really entail and make sure that it fits with your appetite. You're signing up for a minimum of 3 years and possibly 9. So a lot of people don't expect there's that sort of length of tenure that's expected. So it's something people don't always know. The other thing I've heard people say to me about it is, what you mean I'm actually responsible even as a non-exec director? And the answer is yes, you are. You have a fiduciary duty in law to that entity, which, you know, is lovely until something goes badly wrong. And then, you know, you might want to just have a look at whether you've got the bandwidth and appetite and capability of helping if anything did go wrong. But you are as responsible for that company or organization as the chief executive. And in a charity, most chief executives aren't even on the board. The trustees, it's not a sort of grace and favor appointment where you swan in and deliver a few words of wisdom and go home and feel frightfully grand. You know, it's actually a serious responsibility. So I think really look at what these roles are actually about. And I think there's a lot of you know, people think it's a jolly fun senior thing, and actually it is a little bit more serious than that. Definitely start with a charity board. I think they are very much more easy to be hired. I don't think it's easy even when you've got your first one, actually. It's probably less impossible, but it's not necessarily easy. And I think then you can demonstrate to other boards you've been house trained for boards, because it's a very different sort of protocol to whatever you've done before. It's much more gracious generally. It's much more, have you considered? Your role is as a critical friend to the executive team. You know, you shouldn't pile in and tell them what you would do. So it's a very different sort of spirit around that boardroom table. But once you've sort of demonstrated you can do that, then it's possible to go on to grow your portfolio. I was really surprised how difficult it is to get those jobs. It could just be me. I mean, it could just be me.
It is very challenging. It's not just you, I promise.
And I think there's one person who's an incredibly famous marketer, and she applied for a non-exec and she didn't get it, and it was the first job she hadn't got in like 3 decades, and she was so affronted. She's actually decided that whole thing is not for her. So at the other end of the scale, I don't know who the individual was, but she's a legendary member of WACL who applied for 98 jobs, 98 non-exec roles before getting them. So somewhere between 1 and not trying anymore and 98 is where you probably would be going. There are not, it's very skills driven. A board will want a skill set, and they don't want lovely people who don't have those skills. They will be looking very square peg, square hole, more, I think, than even an executive position, actually. And not very many boards want marketers or brand people. So, you know, there are not going to be hundreds of boards that are looking for the skills that marketers have. So you immediately have a lower range of opportunity. Now, they may want your particular industry. For example, one of the most successful NEDs I know has had a very long career in food industry, kind of family restaurant industry. And, a lot of the NED roles she's getting are in businesses in that category. So that's the other sort of pathway, the category, rather than the if you like, marketing skills. And then you have to imagine, if I'm advising the chief exec and the chief financial officer, who are mostly the individuals on the board of those organizations, have I got the credibility to be advising them and pitch what you apply for accordingly? And I think you're probably going to be one league or even two leagues down than your executive career, because you are going to be the person to whom that chief exec and that finance director is going to respect. It's a complex picture, actually, and I've applied for quite a lot of non-exec roles, and I've not got quite a lot of non-exec roles. I'm always furious, but I've got to the final shortlist on several, and then it's not about capability, it's just about fit. I do find it very, very rewarding. I find it seriously interesting, very stimulating, but it is quite serious, I think. And people always say it's great fun. I've not found it fun as much as fascinating, I think.
Thank you. That is a very honest and helpful insight for people. And so I get asked the question an awful lot, so they can hopefully take your tips on board. Thinking of marketers again now specifically for a moment, you've got an incredible network, and I just wondered what your thoughts are in terms of current priorities for marketers in the next sort of 12-18 months. Are you hearing certain things being repeated by the senior cohort?
Yes, I am, actually. And it's not about AI. I mean, we're always twittering about some latest development, aren't we, as an industry? It's not that. Of course, everybody's going to have to sort themselves out on that front. What I'm hearing, which I find concerning, and I think we have to sort of take matters into our own hands, is just how sort of burnt out and bullied people are feeling in the industry. I did a session the other day with NEDs mentoring, kind of rising star marketers, and this was a huge, huge theme in the room. And I think if I want to sort of give any counsel or something that needs doing, I think we need to reconnect with our courage, and I think we need to reclaim the power of marketing. And I'm not advocating for that in a sort of lippy way. We don't just have to get more lippy. I think there needs to be building self-efficacy by growing our substance. Interestingly, I did a talk at a higher education conference, and I asked everybody in the room if they had a marketing qualification, and everybody did. They're working in universities. And I then said, have you ever heard of or read any of these books or attended any of these courses? Mark Ritson mini MBA, Peter Field, Byron Sharp, my own book. Absolutely not at all. Really? So I found that so surprising. And what I'm advocating for is really to kind of build your understanding so that you have more confidence to challenge back in the organization where you're being told to just do it, or just give me one number and it's all, where's the data? I think we have to sort of build back our courage, and that's going to be built by a number of things. One is sort of educating ourselves beyond our own job. The other one is actually the thing I've mentioned earlier, is building your commercial understanding. And I think doing that by making friends with either your, business partner in finance or the CFO or whoever, to really, really understand how the company makes money and how it's doing and how marketing can contribute to that. Feeling more like the department that's helping to earn the money rather than the department that's just fighting for its budget. budget so that it can spend it. So I think building our commercial grip is going to help that sense of we get this, and build our confidence and our courage. I think the value of the emotional argument is quite a funny one as well, because there's so much debate about data and facts, and kind of marketing ultimately is about people, the customers that we serve, and they are not totally rational beings. So, and neither are our colleagues. So occasionally just having the guts to say, I remember saying this to the chief financial officer at Vodafone UK, I don't care if God wanted me to change the minds of the British public faster. It can't be done unless you double my budget. My targets are pretty damn ambitious, and I'm not accepting a bigger one. So that was quite, I've always been slightly punchy, hence the refreshing, on a cold day, on a bad day, it's a cold shower, on a good day, it's lovely, fun sunshine. So, but I sometimes think you just have to assert yourself, and sometimes it's more of an emotional appeal than just a sort of argument.
Yeah.
Because persuasion is more than argument. And I think recognizing that and feeling the confidence to do it. And then lastly, it was really interesting in this room. I suddenly got this sort of sense that there was a great fear in our, aspiring marketers of being fired. So they're given that there were, 15, 16 non-exec directors there, all quite, quite august personages. I actually stood up and said, can I ask the non-execs who in this room has been fired? And all but one put their hand up. And I said to the person who and who has not, and one person put their hand up. He said, "But I work for myself." So, and I think just having that sense that don't be afraid. Don't seem to be fired, clearly, but it's not the worst thing that can happen to you. Don't let that hold you back. You will be fine. And as one of my former bosses used to say to me, they are not going to steal your children. What do you think they're going to do to you? Steal your children? The worst that can happen is that you will get fired. You'll be fine. You'll get another job, and life will move on, and if that is the thing, the fear that's holding you back, try not to let that take root, really. So I think, reconnecting with our courage and reclaiming our power is what we need to do. And for, also to some degree, a little bit of swagger. I don't like the word because it suggests that sort of empty, lippy version of marketing, which I'm not fond of. But I think, we are doing something that's rather marvelous, and actually that's an opportunity to make friends in your company with other functions, isn't it? Come along and see our new ad, or come to the shoot and see Idris Elba appear in our ad or something. You've got such assets to leverage to build that influence in your organization. And I think we need to really, really start to try and do some of that. The thing I hear most as well is we don't have time. And my response to that is, do you have any pointless meetings? And everybody says, yeah. And I'll
Everyone
say,
puts their hands up at that point.
Cancel them, and then you'll find the time.
Yeah, I love that. So courage, commerciality, bit of swagger, and
swagger with substance. Can we have that one?
Daryl, to finish us off then, because it works well on your theme of courage. On every Q&A session we do, we talk about positive and resilient mindset, because my personal belief is that all successful professionals, all successful leaders have a positive and resilient mindset. Do you have any tips or kind of rituals that you practice yourself that other people may find helpful? Clearly you've got bags of resilience. You're a very positive, very dynamic person. Anything you would share with the audience that may help them?
Yes, well, I would like to say that, I do have my down days, and I have suffered, at the hands of others in my career, and there's been a mental health impact on that. So, I think it's important that people know that there's another side to what one presents, and I would rather be open about that. I'm a great fan of a new book that's come out by Laura Chamberlain, who's a professor of marketing at Warwick Business School, and she's written a book called Brilliantly Bouncy. And she's talking a little bit about resilience being a little bit beyond just sort of restoring your shape after a negative impact, and actually really investing in your reserves, building that. And I think probably more by accident than by design, I've managed to do that over the years. I think I've always been very, very protective of weekends and holidays. In all honesty, last year was the first year I've ever not taken my decent amount of my holiday, and I felt that at the end of the year. So, I know we're all calling it annual leave now, which is a term that makes me absolutely nuts, I have to say, because it's like we're all in the army or something, along with us all being called chief, this, that, and the other officers. But I think we're calling it that because it's like, I deserve a rest after all this hard work. Please don't beat me and text me. Well, it's a protective mechanism, I think, that's a symptom of the fact of this sort of always on. So I really think that one has to put boundaries around weekends and holidays. And I think I've always managed to do that. I'm lucky. I'm an Olympic sleeper. I am really good at sleeping, and it's just a gift. However, if I weren't, I would really work at that because, funnily enough, I read a book about why we sleep, and I didn't sleep well for 3 weeks, worrying about whether I was doing it well, which was quite funny, ironic. But it's a good book to read, and getting into the habits that will enable you to sleep well, because our performance is so impacted if we don't. So get some sleep. And then I think the last thing is, if you really feel that the situation you're in is damaging you, walk away. You will be fine. And I've probably done that a couple of times in my life where I've gone, if I stay here, my confidence will be destroyed, or my marriage will be on the rocks or whatever, and you can walk away. My first husband and I always wanted something that we would describe as a certain verb off money, and having a little bit of a financial that you could afford to walk away. It is hard to build, I know, but just having a sense that you can pay the mortgage for 6 months, or you're not the only breadwinner, and if you are, having that, we could rent a room to pay the mortgage. I don't know what that is, but having your sort of parachute plan is always a really, really good idea. Something I haven't done and wish I had, which I think I'm sort of doing a little bit with this sort of new venture, is to get a personal advisory board. I'm not very good at asking for help and advice. And I've started to do that now. And I know some very successful individuals who've done this. And I wish I'd known this, sort of 20, 30 years ago. Build a personal advisory board about you and your career. And a number of individuals who you can turn to for help and advice and counsel about what you should do next. And I think that would be a great thing for everybody to think about.
Excellent. Daryl, thank you. Brilliant answers to those questions. What an absolute pleasure. Thank you so much for your time.
Pleasure. I've had fun, and it's made me think. I always like these things because I always come up with new insights when I'm asked to do them. So thank you. I've learnt from the experience as well.
Excellent. Lovely positive reflection. Thank you ever so much.